themselves rangers who are former combatants. And a lot of the things you see along the way are monuments to the war. So you get to visit like a field hospital where they treat the wounded. Or you get to see this thing called a Vietnamese stove, which was a technique they learned from the Vietnamese guerrillas, which was to dig a hole into the mountainside and put your stove in there, and it allowed for the smoke to dissipate into the earth and come up in a way that wouldn't be detected in the air, so that we could cook without being bombarded, and a variety of things like that along the way. So it combines this current orientation toward this environmental orientation, but it reflects the history of the war in an attempt to preserve the memory and the people who are running it themselves and have direct experience.
Is there any follow-up plan? When you come back and you go to the communications done, or what happens next, I guess, in terms of your involvement or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely left it open for us to join the Sister Cities Network. Currently, each of us are doing different projects, I think. There were 4 different projects that we can do for this to the end of the year. One of them has to do with historical memory, education, environment, and women's organizing. So we're definitely, some people are still in communication and getting things for that project.
So what we have to do between us the 4 groups is we have to make a form of popular education. Doesn't need to be extravagant, but something that you can like express to the public to relate concerns here with their concerns and establish sort of like a connection to make, I guess, to express solidarity. So
I really encourage you and your leadership as well to follow up on that idea of bringing what you do and learn and also know back to, because there's so many parallel areas of concern, so many parallel issues, so many struggles that we face just like.
Mining is
of
one
course,
of them.
yeah.
So
I was
we
just
just-
El Salvador is facing a lawsuit where they're getting sued by a Canadian company. So this Canadian company is called Pacific Rim, and what they're doing is through CAFTA, they put an institution in the United States and was able to go through CAFTA, and they essentially bypass everything and was able.
Which they can do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So by way of example, my wife and I went down twice, once with Sister Cities and once another group. But after the Sister Cities experience, it was a very small delegation to look for us. I heard Conrad, he's not Conrad now, led that with me still being faculty, I'm not sure. But,
What year is that?
early this century. After 2000. But we came back and did, in effect, a community-wide seminar on El Salvador, but not just, it wasn't just, well, this is happening there. We tried to make this
The
connection. So it was a collaborative effort with the university faculty participating, with the head group faculty. We brought paid for it. I was at MATC and my wife was at the same time, so we were in college, and money then we could pay transportation for friends with me in El Salvador to come here, that participated in speaking to the public. Former ambassador White came. He was the one let go by Nixon after the incident with the nuns. The nuns came home. And it was my only point is, what you're doing here is fabulous. And the broader and expression of those connections you can establish with the massive community, the better. And I think it's always interesting here in what's going on to get a public community crowd, young university people like me that are just still interested in connecting with nobles and Sister Cities and know you. So thanks for this. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I thought maybe we had the same we may have stayed in the same
Oh,
house.
that's right.
That's why I asked my
Who was
question. She was a health provider. Her name was Luce. She had two young boys. And I'll never forget this because the bed that Barb and I slept in when we got home had a Che Guevara poster. So, you know, she had been a combatant as a teenager.
Like-
And still.
I think we're out of time, a little over, but thank you all for listening, coming here, seeing our presentation.
Thanks for the good food.
Yeah, and if anyone else does have any questions, feel
That's I started a classroom on sign-up sheet for the Haven Center email list. So if you want to get Haven Center emails about future events, just fill out your name here. And also, First Fantasia will be having office hours this Thursday from 10 to 12. So if you want to see him, talk about your research, what have you, contact me, come to me at the end of the event, and I can fit you in the slot.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Don Taylor from the Department of Labor Education in UW Extension, also known as the School for Workers. And I have the honor of introducing our guest today. Rick Fantasia is the Barbara Richmond 1940 Professor in the Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. His research has been driven by questions of labor and culture and their interpenetration both in the US and France. He writes periodically for Le Monde Diplomatique and is the author of Cultures of Solidarity, Consciousness, Action, and Contemporary American Workers, and co-author with Kim Voss of Hard Work, Remaking the American Labor Movement. His recent research has concerned the symbolic economy of French gastronomy and the dynamics of its transformation as a cultural field, which brings us to today's talk, Reign of Le Terroir, French Gastronomy in the Age of Neoliberalism. With that, I give you Rick Fantasia.
So listen, many thanks for giving me this opportunity. To Eric Wright and Patrick Barrett and his staff, Richard and everyone else for allowing me to spend this week here in Madison, for arranging the trip. It's my first visit to this university and to this Department of Sociology, both of which I've always greatly admired. My admiration has, however, over the past 2 years become something akin to veneration, if not outright worship, not just of the university and the department, but of a city that, to a labor sociologist like me, has become essentially sacred ground after the extraordinary events of 2 years ago. So while immensely grateful for the opportunity to be here and to share my work with you, it's also been for me a kind of a pilgrimage, if you will, that has magnified a sense of wonder that I feel being in Madison. My lecture, today, I'm not going to be addressing the questions of labor and working class culture and collective action, which are probably the reasons that people thought to even consider inviting me. Although my research on French gastronomy was initially motivated, I think, by some of the same sentiments that motivate my interest in working class culture and the labor movement. Psychoanalytically, perhaps, if not socioanalytically, for I was intent early on with this research to pierce the bubble of bourgeois pretension, not of French bourgeois pretensions, but of American bourgeois pretensions, for whom all things European and French in the cultural realm have always been objects of reverence. Cars and fashions and foods and even social theories. My plan to lay this out to you is to present an analysis of a cultural field, French gastronomy in this case, which I've been working on for a very, very long time, kind of on the side. Only published a couple of things on it over the years, but I'm now trying to complete it in the coming months. And so being here and being able to do this has been great for me because it's, in a sense, allowed me to prepare a lecture that prods me toward completing it by tracing, I want to trace the arc of the trajectory of the research for you, but it's sort of at the other end of it, at the end of the talk, the last, section of it that I'm sort of laying out new for the first time for myself. But generally, there's a focus here in what I'll present on three main intersections along my trajectory or route, three problematics in the recent history of this cultural field. The first is the introduction of American fast food into French cultural space. The second being the logic of the process by which traditional French cuisine, French haute cuisine, was transformed and has been transformed in this process, shaken up, if you will, and how this logic has been extended to the farthest reaches of the French cultural imagination, to the terroir, this term, it's kind of a mysterious term that's getting bandied about a lot in American culture now, but we'll talk about it in a few minutes, and la France profonde, the deep France, the kind of recesses of the French cultural imagination. I'm going to use PowerPoint today, at least PowerPoint images with no text, to provide a visual backdrop of the agents and the institutions who inhabit this cultural domain that I want to tell you about. My interest in this material was driven really less by an interest in food and foodways early on than it was by an interest in the social and economic effects of US cultural influence. Besides the fact that I was spending time there for family reasons on a regular basis, it seemed that no other society was as engaged in defending its cultural patrimony as aggressively as France has for gastronomy. In France, gastronomy has been among the crucial 2 or 3 pillars of the cultural patrimony. And this, for me, led initially to a study of fast food in France back in the 90s, where I was interested in understanding the introduction of this cultural practice and of this system among consumers, as well as a system of production for employers and for their workers. In the research, I sought to demonstrate the distinctiveness of fast food in the realm of consumption practices, French consumption practices, including the menu for sure, the food behind the counter, but also the atmosphere of restaurants, the uses of space, and these were quite new in the 1980s when they were introduced. The uses of space, the surface textures of the restaurants, the lighting levels. I took a photometer into McDonald's and fast food restaurants in France, but also traditional restaurants, and used that. And I have tables in the first thing I wrote about this with looking at lighting meters, because I was really quite interested in the American presentation of a new form of cultural hyperbole, using lighting and color and imagery. And also the service innovations that these restaurants brought, the new kinds of self-service practices, a standard for queuing in restaurants, which at the time was quite new, new ways of eating with one's hands, unwrapping food individually was a new phenomenon. And in fact, in the first McDonald's that I visited back in the late 80s by now, in southeastern France, there had been no other fast food restaurants. And at the first opening of the restaurant in a town called Annecy, the restaurant, the McDonald's, had an interlocutor, and someone at the door who would guide customers inside, show them where to stand, kind of explain the menu and how it works. This was all fairly new in the French social universe. Also, I was interested in understanding the customer base of these restaurants. I looked at, using French marketing studies mostly, the social background of consumers, by gender, by social occupation, and also as an expression of cultural transgression by French youth. In the first decade or so of the market, it was dominated by French young people, and I have a kind of an analysis of that I'm not going to share now, but it has to do with a kind of form of cultural rebellion that Americanism represented to the French. Also, I was interested in the restaurant sites, literally the geography of the restaurants on French cultural space, the symbolic place of McDonald's on the French landscape, and also McDonald's as a real estate company, which has an enormous amount of capital to locate sites in the most traffic busy intersections, not only in Paris or in France, but in the world. with a distinctiveness of fast food, and this was my concern throughout these segments of this research, the distinctiveness of fast food in relation to traditional French culture, French restaurants. Also not only in the realm of consumption, but in the realm of production practices, characterized by computerized accounting systems, accounting systems that allow McDonald's in Oak Brook, Illinois, to know the number of milkshakes sold in any outlet, in any restaurant in Paris at any time of the day. The hyper-rationalization of food preparation, which was something quite new in France, to break the process down using this, what's the word? Starts with a V, I can't think of that word. Term from labor process literature. Anyway, the labor process is broken down into its simplest parts. Thank you. The extensive use of contingent part-time labor in these restaurants, and a virulent anti-unionism that McDonald's was bringing along, introducing it into the French service sector. These were consumption and production practices that were relatively new, and especially in the service sector and the restaurant industry. Though there were moments in which McDonald's was forced to adapt itself to French practices as well, as this strike, a 1.5-year-old worker occupation of a McDonald's outlet in Paris demonstrated, and was a symbol for the years that it was being occupied. By pulling at the threads of McDonald's in France, I soon found myself in a world of industrial processes and industrial organizations, a world propelled by the economic power of the Grand Groupe Agroalimentaire, the large corporate food processing sector, which had developed in the 1970s and into the 1980s in France. These are corporate conglomerates with names like Accor and Sodexo and Nestle and Unilever, who are heavy investors in large vertically integrated food processing companies, in chain restaurants, in cafeterias, and in French fast food companies. These are organizations that model themselves after the McDonald's formula. These French fast food companies, down in this segment, hamburgers and fast food of McDonald's really at the time were almost secondary to the French fast food companies that were appearing fairly regularly in the 1980s. But the McDonald's formula was modeled by French hamburger companies, particularly during about an 8-year period in which McDonald's was tied up in lawsuits on the French market, and they couldn't expand on the French market. They appeared in the 1970s, but in fact, they were pretty much confined to 11 outlets in Paris, while the French firms were fighting them in court. And anyway, McDonald's won the lawsuit, but it freed, in a sense, it gave an 8-year period in which French firms could model themselves after the American formula, set up hamburger restaurants throughout France with names like Quick and Free Time and Kiss Burger and Love Burger and Katie's Burger. These were American-sounding names that were perfect examples of what has been called organizational isomorphism. They had all the visual displays of American fast food restaurants with French fries and milkshakes and hamburgers and that. However, the lawsuit ends in about 1982. I guess they were freed then to open their outlets on the market. And the French market for fast food is soon overwhelmed by McDonald's and its massive marketing budget and capital base, which allows it to secure the most expensive real estate sites for its outlets throughout Paris and France. And so while McDonald's started up, when it started up, it installed about 150 restaurants between 1982 and 1989. Sorry about this. Is the right size? Is it big enough for you? Okay, so each of these golden arches represents 10 McDonald's outlets in the period from 1982 and 1989, when they fully wound up McDonald's and decided to expand into the French market in a big way. In 1989, they swept most of the French firms, French hamburger firms from the market within just a few years, installing one new McDonald's outlet every week for over a 20-year period, so that by 2009, there were 1,200 McDonald's in France. Again, each of the, you can just see it. I mean, they're everywhere. They're not only in Paris and Bordeaux and Lyon and Marseille, but they're also throughout the country in small regional cities of 30,000. Now, I might have stopped this research there, and I actually did for a couple of years. Figuring that I had developed a reasonably good detailed case study of Americanization, and would have stopped and would have written a book that would have been, you know, a reasonably characteristic book from the kind of cultural studies perspective, focusing on both production and consumption, on design, and on all the things that, say, I don't know, Dick Ebdage, his book on, or his article on Italian motor scooters in Italy in the post-war period, for me it was emblematic of the kind of cultural studies analysis that was interesting. And that's what I sort of modeled this after at the time. But then I encountered Pierre Bourdieu, whose radical relationalism encouraged me to push beyond the boundary that I had set around my project, prompting me to reconstruct the focus and object of my analysis, to try to encompass a broader field of relationships and mechanisms that linked mass culture to high culture, linked fast food to haute cuisine, and that linked the local to the regional, and linked Americanization, which was my initial kind of political project, to globalism more generally. By field, and that's what I had to do, is construct, in a sense, a field. I mean a distinctive social microcosm that develops its own characteristic practices, rules, and forms of authority, standards of evaluation, distinct domains of human activity and practice that develop over time, that change, that sometimes wane, and that are more or less autonomous. That is, more or less able to insulate itself from the external influences and maintain its own criteria of evaluation, its own sort of integrity as an activity, against those of neighboring or intruding fields. This is sort of the generic framework that I used for analyzing cultural fields. The key axes along on the horizontal side are production practices, from the industrial to the artisanal. The industrial being things that are the value that is placed on practices that are short time, that are modern in technique, and that are highly standardized, as against the artisanal, take a long time, and that's valued, that value traditional technique, and that value unique, non-standard practices. The consumption axis vertically are at the top restricted markets for luxury goods, characterized by, as we all know, sophistication and complexity of practice, formality, things that are high in expense, low in volume, and that are exclusive. As against the mass market at the bottom of goods that are produced for convenience and simplicity, informality, that are inexpensive, that are high volume production lines, and that are inclusive, allow people accessible. In most markets, in the French market, the American goods are represented at the lower right quadrant, and French goods tend to be represented to the world, and that's the French kind of representation of itself to the world in the realm of economic and cultural goods in the upper left quadrant. In that initial phase of the research, that is studying fast food in France, I was, it turns out, only seeing a limited universe of practices and institutions that are reflected in this southeast quadrant of the diagram, with fast food and its industrial relatives engaged in practices geared toward mass markets, high volume production, advanced industrial techniques, and where the US is known for its leadership and mastery in this domain internationally. It is the obverse of haute cuisine as a cultural practice, and traditional cultural representations of Frenchness. Traditionally, the world of haute cuisine was a world largely unto itself, operating as a relatively autonomous domain of culinary practices, its own rules and regulations, its own forms of authority, its own standards. And autonomy achieved largely, by the way, there was, in a sense, a firewall between these two worlds. When I began the project and interviewing fast food executives and food journalists in France, they wouldn't acknowledge that this new fast food phenomenon had anything to do with traditional French cuisine. It was a different universe. And over and over again, they said, when I would ask, well, what about the introduction of American kinds of food and ways of eating? They didn't want to acknowledge it as an introduction into France. Really, it was an American thing that operated on the French market. Yes?
Does the arrangement of these work hosts have any meaning in it? Is the distance between them, are you doing anything like that with these, or is it just sort of to create?
I want to do something with the distance between them, based upon volumes of capital that are deployed on each side. I haven't done it yet. This is my approximation as to where these things kind of ought to be. So this is quite a subjective kind of, this is sort of to help you see the relationships, but not the depth of the relationships, really. So I can't, I don't want to do the history of this developing field. Other historians and historians have done that. But it was an autonomy that was achieved over time.
People who give you tours, typically, we didn't get this opportunity the moment we arrived, are themselves rangers who are former combatants. And a lot of the things you see along the way are monuments to the war, so you get to visit like a field hospital where they treated the wounded. Or you get to see this thing called a Vietnamese stove, which was a technique they learned from the Vietnamese guerrillas, which was to dig a hole into a mountainside and put your stove in there, and it allowed for the smoke to dissipate into the earth and come up in a way that wouldn't be detected in the air, so that it could cook without being bombarded, and a variety of things like that along the way. So it combines this current orientation toward this environmental orientation, but it reflects the history of the war in an attempt to preserve the memory, and the people who are running it themselves have direct experience.
Is there any follow-up plan? You know, when you come back and you're going to get communications done, or what happens next, I guess, in terms of your involvement or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely left it open for us to join the Sister Cities Network. Currently, each of us are doing different projects, I think. There were 4 different projects that we can do for the end of the year. One of them has to do with historical memory, education, environment, and women's organizing. So we're definitely, some people are still in communication and getting things for that project.
So what we have to do between us for the 4 groups is we have to.
And also know that because there's so many parallel areas of concern, so many parallel issues, so many struggles that we face just like.
Mining is
Oh,
one
of course.
them.
Yeah,
That
I
we
was just,
just-
yeah. El Salvador is facing a lawsuit where they're getting sued by a Canadian company. So this Canadian company is called Pacific Rim, and what they're doing is through CAFTA, they put an institution in the United States and was able to go through CAFTA, and they essentially make a form of popular education. Doesn't need to be extravagant, but something that you can express to the public to relate concerns here with their concerns and establish sort of like a connection to make, I guess, to express, solidarity. So.
I really encourage you and your leadership as well to follow up on that